Welcome to the SOS video for Unit 3, Lesson 4 on creating a proportion to solve equations with rational expressions. So our vocabulary reminders: a proportion is when one ratio or fraction is equal to another ratio or fraction. No other fractions or other math symbols are involved. Restrictions or when we talk about a value for a variable in the denominator that makes the denominator equal to 0. Remember, if something is divided by 0, it is undefined, and we cannot have an undefined fraction. So we look at the restrictions. What values would make it undefined? And finally, LCD stands for lowest common denominator, and we're going to need that to add or subtract fractions. So a rational equation must not have a value of 0 in the denominator. Any value that makes the denominator equal to 0 is called a restriction. So we are asked to find the restricted value for each rational equation. So the only thing I'm going to look at is the denominator, and I'm going to say what value for x would make this whole denominator equal to 0. So you're solving for x. I subtract 3 from both sides, subtraction property of equality, and I have x equals -3. That would be my restriction. So we actually say x cannot equal -3, because if it did, this would equal 0. Okay, how about for the next one? We're only interested in the denominators that have a variable. So I look at 2x minus 10. And when is 2x minus 10 equal to 0? And I solve for that. I add 10 to both sides, addition property of equality. I have 2x equals 10. I divide both sides by 2, division property of equality. X equals 5. So when x equals 5, 2 times 5 is 10. 10 minus 10 is 0. That makes this denominator equal to 0. So our restriction is x cannot equal 5. Okay, now let's solve a rational equation by creating a proportion. Remember, if we add or subtract fractions, the denominators must be the same. And if they aren't the same, we have to make them the same. So the denominators are not the same. We're going to find the LCD, least common denominator, and we'll write an equivalent fraction with the LCD. We'll multiply it by a form of 1. Once we do that, then we can add or subtract the rational expressions on one side to make one single fraction. We'll cross multiply. We'll solve the equation like we typically do, and make sure to always check your answer. So let's look at the first one. This is not a proportion, because even though I see a fraction equal to another fraction, I see a third fraction, and I also see another math symbol. So let me try to create a single fraction from the two fractions on this side. And I can't combine them yet because they do not have the same denominator. So I look to see, well, what is my LCD? What is the smallest number that both of these are factors of? And that is 15. So how do I get x over 3 equal to something over 15? Well, I need to multiply the bottom by 5, which means I need to do the same thing on top. This is called a form of 1 because 5 divided by 5 is 1, and 1 times anything doesn't change its value. That's why we're allowed to multiply by a form of 1. So then we have minus 2x over 5. How do I make 5 my least common denominator of 15? I multiply the bottom by 3, so I have to do the same on top. And that equals -7 over 15. Okay, 5 times x is 5x over 15 minus 2x times 3 is 6x over 15 equals -7 over 15. Since I now have the same denominator, I can keep the denominator and combine this. 5 minus 6x is a -x. -x over 15 is a -7 over 15. And if you want, you could cross multiply. Some of you might have realized, oh, this 15 times 1 is this, so I really can say -x is -7. But if you didn't see that, we can cross multiply. We take a number on the bottom, multiply by the top number of the other fraction. So 15 times -7 equals, I take the bottom number of the other fraction, multiply it by the top number of the previous one, 15 times -x. Since I see both of these have a 15, I could divide by 15 on each side, division property of equality. I have -7 equals -x. Well, to solve for x, this is the same as multiplying by a -1. I'm going to divide by a -1, and a -7 divided by -1 is 7, so 7 equals x. And make sure you substitute it in here to see if it works. That's a great calculator one to try out. Okay, let's take a look at number 2. Think of what your least common denominator would be. And you're right, it's going to be 10 because both 5 and 2 are factors of 10. So 3a over 5, what do I multiply 5 by to get 10? I multiply by 2. So I have to do the same thing on top. That is my form of 1. Minus, well, a over 2, I need to make this equal to 10. So 2 times 5 is 10. So I do the same thing on top. And that's going to equal 1 over 20. Okay, 2 times 3a is 6a. 2 times 5 is 10. Minus 5 times a is 5a. 2 times 5 is 10. And that equals 1 over 20. Since we now have the same denominator, I can keep the denominator and just subtract this. 6a minus 5a is a, equals 1 over 20. I now have a proportion, one fraction equal to another fraction, and I cross multiply to solve for a. So 10 times 1 is going to be 20 times a. 10 times 1 is 10, equals 20a. Well, to isolate a, instead of multiplying by 20, I'm going to divide by 20. So 10 over 20 is 1/2. We could either write 1/2 or 0.5. Just make sure your fraction is reduced, and we can change this to a decimal as long as it's not a repeating decimal. And 20 divided by 20, any number divided by itself is 1, and we're left equals a. So a is 1/2, or you could say 0.5 is a. And that is how we are able to solve a rational equation by creating a proportion.